When it's time for me to say what I really think or believe, it's usually best for me to truly say it, using my own words. Welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. So this week we're turning back to the communications category for thing number 43, say it in your own words. Next week I want to stay in the communications category and talk a little bit about the moral and ethical import of the words we say and the language we use. But today, I'm going to think first about the cognitive implications of wrestling our beliefs or our feelings or our inklings into language of our own making. I used to teach writing at a big public university, and I worked with many kinds of writers who were working toward many kinds of degrees. And I actually spent a lot of time working with engineering students in particular. But whatever you're writing about, whether it's for a class or in a journal, trying to make sense of your thoughts at the end of the day, or today, mostly in a social media post, when you write something out using your own language, you clarify your thoughts for yourself as much as you do for others. The act of taking what we feel about an issue or a question and translating all of those inklings and inclinations into a clear articulation of exactly what we're trying to say about what we believe forces us to really engage the particulars of the issue and of our own feelings about it. And we almost always will just go on to the next step at that point, kind of on autopilot, and talk about the warrants of the argument, the whys of why we feel or think in that particular way. And for me, anyway, I never truly understand my own positions until I can write or talk them out in a concise and clear way. I think this is absolutely true about big issues like whether we still need the Electoral College, but it's as true about medium level issues about whether I want to host Thanksgiving at my house this year or if it's time to buy a new car or not. But even something as tiny as whether it's advisable to take 15 minutes and detour to pick up coffee on my way to work this morning is part of the argumentation process of daily life. And to be fair, most of the time we do the smaller ones automatically. We translate that into our own language and our own thinking pretty much on autopilot. I simply say to myself or to others, I'm going to pass on Starbucks this morning because I'm running late and I have a presentation to get ready for. I articulate my own arguments in these small moments by default because one, they're simple to articulate, and two, the pressure to get the writing or the wording correct is really low. It's usually an audience of the self or one or two other people. And it's certainly not something we're going to come back to and really think deeply about the language we chose. But sometimes when I move into bigger issues, and I think especially ones that are at all contentious, it feels easier and sometimes wiser to kind of outsource the wording of our arguments to third parties. I might, quote a line from a romantic comedy and use it as shorthand to tell my date how cute he is rather than fumbling through my own weird articulation of that sentiment. Or I might seize on a line from a newspaper editorial that perfectly encapsulates what I want to say about term limits in Congress. We all do some version of that appropriation all the time. And it's not a problem when we're already really clear on what we think or feel or believe. But it seems that given the amount of public posting that goes on these days, sometimes I and a lot of us lean too hard on other people's ways of putting things, or maybe just lean in too soon to the language of other people before I've done the hard and sometimes uncomfortable work of really hashing out what I think for myself on my own terms and in my own terms, trusting in my own words. And sometimes I think political memes are one of the worst things that has ever happened to public discourse. That's probably not fair because I think they've always been around in some form. like maybe in some ways that aren't very different from the slogan, say, from Eisenhower's 1952 campaign, which allowed people to simply say, I like Ike, without really digging into why. But the memification of political debate is on a whole other order of magnitude, I think, now. Memes are everywhere. They are set up for every possible issue, and they're created within seconds of it becoming an issue. And it's just a dangerously addictive shortcut, in my experience, to actually taking a beat and figuring out what I think and exactly why. Instead of having to sit down and think through the argument we want to make, there's a fast and often funny way to say it and move on with our day. And I get the appeal of that. And I have shared my fair share of memes over the years. But when I do that, before I'm really, really clear on what I personally believe about this issue or this problem or this question, I'm short circuiting a whole lot of critical thinking that happens when we move from thinking into language. And also, putting my thoughts in my own words gives me a crucial opportunity to speak it back. We talk about speaking it back a ton in my workplace, and I think it's one of the reasons that we have really very little internal miscommunication about what we're doing or what we're making or when it's due. If I get verbal feedback, say, or if I'm listening to a discussion about what we're trying to accomplish for a client, I almost always will say before the meeting is over, let me speak this back to you. And this is especially crucial when I have an active role to play in getting us to done. So I'll say, let me speak this back to you to make sure we're on the same page. I am writing the epilogue to this deliverable, and Anne is handling the proofreading, or whatever the delineation of duties is. It's a really crucial moment to check what I heard and absorbed against what was actually said or what was actually happening. And it's astonishing how often gaps open up between those two bodies of information. And I think that something kind of akin to that process happens when I force myself to write or speak in my own words what I really think about something or anything and why. And also, this process of forcing myself to write out or speak out my own thoughts in my own words, it's another chance to interrogate my thinking and to hear my own ideas and my own argument privately, to do kind of another dress rehearsal before I share things out publicly. And that's important because there's a thing called commitment bias, or it's also known as the escalation of commitment, which is a cognitive bias that leads us to stick with the ideas and the beliefs that we have become emotionally invested in, even if we start seeing clear evidence that these ideas and beliefs might be wrong. And one of the accelerants, I guess, to emotional investment in a belief is actually public identification with that belief. So if we've announced, say, an opposition to seatbelt laws on Instagram, I have no idea why people would be doing that, but just as an example, we can start to feel like we're publicly linked with that position. And so sometimes we hold tighter to that belief than we otherwise would, than if we just, mulled the issue privately and kept our thoughts to ourselves. So giving myself that little gap to think something through one more time and translate it into my own words, it just gives me a little more time and space to come to an independent and well reasoned conclusion before I marry myself to it in the public eye. And finally, and linked very closely to that, I think the whole idea of translating a belief into my own words before sharing it or endorsing it publicly is useful, if only because it makes me question whether I need to be espousing an opinion in the first place. And I think we live in a time where everybody is not only welcome to, but almost pressured to, almost expected to have a personal hot take on just about everything. And I sometimes have to remind myself that I don't need to have an opinion on all things. It's exhausting to have an opinion on everything. And it's really impossible to have an informed or well reasoned take on everything. None of us do, none of us can. And because it's more work and more time to type out a position or something in my own words, rather than just clicking share on a meme that momentarily strikes a chord with me. I more often just don't. I don't share an opinion because I don't really have one when it comes down to it, or not one that I care enough about to write out. And no one is waiting for me to give an opinion on, most things. So it's kind of humbling, but it's also kind of freeing, for me at least, to remember that it's not necessarily my job to have to weigh in on everything all the time. Okay, I think that's probably enough of my opinions on this particular issue, even if they are being brought to you in my own words. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and I'll be back next week with thing number 44.